The Morgan estate was nothing short of opulence. A sprawling mansion in the heart of Manhattan, with marble floors so polished they reflected the chandeliers above, and walls adorned with priceless art pieces from around the globe. Grace Morgan stood at the edge of the ballroom, surveying the crowd at her father's gala. Dressed in a custom gold gown that hugged her figure perfectly, she was the epitome of elegance. Yet, behind the perfect facade, Grace felt like a prisoner. Wealth was all she had ever known, but it came with chains, expectations, power plays, and alliances disguised as relationships. She hated it, but she also thrived in it. Tonight was no exception. The crowd was buzzing with excitement over one guest, David Knight. To everyone, David wasn't born into wealth. He had clawed his way up, building a fashion empire from scratch. His story was the kind of inspiration tabloids adored. But in Grace's world, he was an anomaly, new money, someone who didn't understand the delicate rules of her social circle. Grace noticed him the moment he walked in, commanding attention like a king entering his court. His tailored tuxedo, an unmistakable creation of Seville Row's finest, clung to his broad shoulders and lean frame as though it had been designed with him in mind. And perhaps it had. His every movement was deliberate, from the way he adjusted his cufflinks to the confident stride that seemed to part the sea of high society guests. There was a quiet arrogance about him, not loud or flashy, but unmistakably present, as if the world owed him its admiration. Their eyes met across the room, and Grace felt a flicker of something she couldn't name. His gaze was piercing, unapologetically direct, and it unsettled her. For a brief moment, she felt as though he could see past the designer gown, the perfect hair, and the practiced poise. Her heart skipped a beat, but she quickly recovered, masking her reaction with a smirk she had perfected over years of playing the game. Her best friend, Claire, noticed the exchange and leaned in with a knowing smirk of her own. "He's not your type," Claire murmured, swirling the martini in her hand, the olive spinning lazily. "Too ambitious. Men like that always want something." Grace arched an eyebrow, her voice tinged with amusement. "And the ones in this room don't." Claire chuckled softly, a sound that was more cynical than cheerful. "Touché," she said, but her words lingered in Grace's mind as the man moved closer. He was in front of her now, taller than she had anticipated, his presence almost magnetic. Up close, the sharp lines of his jaw and the faint stubble made him look both polished and rugged, a paradox she found intriguing. His cologne, understated yet intoxicating, hinted at power and mystery. "Miss Morgan," he said, extending his hand. His voice was smooth, rich with confidence, but devoid of the usual deference she was used to. He wasn't here to impress her. He was here to engage her. Grace hesitated, her fingers brushing against his as she took his hand. The brief contact sent an inexplicable thrill up her arm. "Mr. Knight," she replied, her tone cool and measured. "Enjoying your first Morgan Gala?" His lips curled into a smile that was equal parts charm and mischief. "I didn't come for the gala," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "I came for the opportunity to meet you." The audacity of his words left Grace momentarily stunned. She was used to flattery, endless streams of it, but this was different. It wasn't the words themselves, but the way he said them, as though he had no doubt they would intrigue her. For a moment, she wasn't sure whether to feel flattered or irritated. She chose the former, if only to see where this would go. "Bold," she said, tilting her head slightly, her smirk deepening. "Most men don't approach me so directly." David shrugged, his confidence unwavering. "Most men aren't worth your time. I'd rather stand out." And he did. Grace couldn't deny it. Men usually tiptoed around her, afraid to say the wrong thing or offend her delicate sensibilities. David, however, seemed completely unaffected by the weight of her family name or the wealth that surrounded her. As the conversation progressed, Grace found herself drawn in despite her initial skepticism. David spoke with passion, recounting the struggles of building his empire from scratch. It wasn't easy, he admitted, his voice carrying a hint of the grit he had buried beneath his polished exterior. "There were times I wanted to give up, but I couldn't. Failure wasn't an option." Grace listened intently, captivated by his ambition and the fire in his eyes. She admired his drive, though a small part of her remained guarded. It was almost too perfect, the self-made man, the rags-to-riches story, the charisma that seemed effortless. "Do you always get what you want, Mr. Knight?" she asked, her voice light but her question loaded. He leaned in slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Not always," he admitted, a glint of something unreadable in his eyes. "But I'm willing to fight for what matters." Grace felt her defenses begin to crack, though she didn't want to admit it. There was something about David Knight that was both thrilling and unnerving, as though he was a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. And as the night wore on, she couldn't shake the feeling that meeting him would change everything. Something about him felt too perfect, too calculated. But before she could untangle the web of her thoughts, David smiled, that same bold confidence lighting up his face. "Shall we dance?" he asked, extending his hand again. Grace hesitated, then placed her hand in his. "Lead the way," she said, her voice steady, though her heart raced. She had no idea what she was stepping into, but she knew one thing for certain. David Knight was no ordinary man, and he wasn't going to play by anyone's rules but his own. Over the following weeks, Grace and David became inseparable. Their dates were extravagant. A private yacht ride along the Amalfi Coast, a weekend getaway to a villa in the south of France, and front-row seats at Paris Fashion Week. David spared no expense, and Grace reveled in the whirlwind romance. But cracks began to show. At a charity gala, Grace overheard two men discussing David. "Knight's company is built on stolen designs," one of them said. "He buried his competitors with lawsuits before they could fight back." Grace's heart sank. She confronted David that night, her voice trembling with anger. "Is it true? Did you steal your way to the top?" David's face hardened, but he didn't deny it. "I did what I had to do, Grace. In business, you either win or you get crushed. I thought you, of all people, would understand." Grace was torn. She admired his drive, but his ruthlessness scared her. Was she falling for a man who was just as deceptive as the world she despised? David Knight's hidden agenda was unfolding perfectly. He had charmed Grace with his smooth words and undeniable charm, convincing her that he was everything she had ever wanted in a partner. Their whirlwind romance had culminated in a grand wedding that made headlines, and everyone believed they were the perfect couple. But the truth was far darker. After their marriage, David made his most calculated move. He secretly acquired her father's company under a false name. Gregory Morgan, unaware that his son-in-law was behind the hostile takeover, was forced to sell the legacy he had spent decades building. The humiliation broke him, leaving him powerless and defeated. Grace, oblivious to the betrayal, continued to love David with all her heart. She believed she had married her soulmate, and even as the man she adored grew cold and distant, she convinced herself it was temporary. She told herself that David was under pressure from work, that his stress was to blame for his sharp words and his growing indifference. David, however, had stopped pretending. He no longer felt the need to maintain the mask of a loving husband. His demeanor toward Grace became harsher, his patience with her non-existent. When she would ask how his day was, he would dismiss her with a curt "fine." When she stayed up late to prepare elaborate dinners for him, hoping to rekindle their connection, he would barely touch the food before retreating to his office or disappearing for the night. Still, Grace held on. She planned romantic evenings, wrote him sweet notes, and even tried to bring up starting a family, thinking it might bring them closer. But David brushed off her efforts, always finding excuses to avoid intimacy. "Not now, Grace. I'm too busy," he would say, his tone devoid of emotion. Behind her back, David savored his triumph. The Morgan Empire was in his hands, and Grace, who had unknowingly helped him get there, was now nothing more than a forgotten piece of the puzzle. To him, her love and care were irrelevant, weaknesses he neither needed nor wanted. But one day, Grace announced news that shook David's world. She was pregnant. "David," she said softly, her hand resting on her stomach, "we're having a baby." Her eyes sparkled with joy, hoping this would soften the distance between them. David's expression darkened. This was not part of his plan. A child complicated everything. "Grace, we're not ready for this," he said coldly. "With everything going on, a baby is the last thing we need." Grace frowned. "What do you mean?" "This is our baby, David." "How can you say that?" David tried to reason with her, masking his irritation. "Think about it, Grace. We're still figuring things out. Maybe. This isn't the right time." But Grace was adamant. "No, David. I'm keeping this baby. I won't let you talk me out of it." Despite his efforts, Grace refused to terminate the pregnancy. For the first time, David felt his control slipping. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Meanwhile, Claire's patience was wearing thin. She had been loyal to David, supporting his plan from the start. But when she discovered that Grace was pregnant, her jealousy boiled over. This was not part of their agreement. David's cruelty toward Grace had always reassured Claire that he didn't care about her. But a child? That felt like a betrayal. "You're losing focus," Claire snapped during one of their secret meetings. This wasn't supposed to happen. A child ties you to her forever. David shrugged, brushing off her concerns. The baby doesn't change anything. Grace is still just a tool. Claire's anger grew. She felt betrayed, not by love, but by the idea that Grace had something she could never have. Driven by jealousy, Claire made a bold move. She went to Grace with the truth. One afternoon, Claire cornered Grace in her home. Her voice was dripping with spite. "Why are you so bent on keeping this man's baby?" she asked. Grace blinked, confused. "What are you talking about?" Claire smirked. "The man you love, your perfect husband, he's been lying to you. He's the one who secretly bought your father's company. He used you to destroy your family." Grace's heart stopped. What are you saying?" Claire laughed bitterly. "He never loved you, Grace. You were just a pawn. Ask him about the company he bought under a false name. Your father drank poison because of him." The weight of the revelation crushed Grace. Her father's death, David's coldness, and now this betrayal. It was all too much. Determined to find the truth, she searched their home and eventually found hidden documents that confirmed Claire's words. David had indeed bought her father's company, disguised under a different name. But it was too late. David had fled the country, leaving behind no trace. In the days that followed, Grace was a shadow of her former self. She cried herself to sleep every night, the betrayal eating away at her. But amidst her grief, something kept her going, her unborn child. Months later, she gave birth to twin boys, Ethan and Liam. They became her source of strength. Grace vowed to raise them with love, to be everything David was not. She poured all her energy into giving them a stable, happy life. 10 years later, Grace's world shifted again. While watching TV, she saw a familiar face. It was David, but now he bore a different name. Sebastian Cole, a wealthy businessman living in Santiago, Chile. His empire had grown, and he appeared to have it all. Grace knew what she had to do. Boarding a flight to Santiago with her 2 sons, she kept her plans quiet. The boys, now 10, didn't fully understand why they were traveling. All they knew was that their mother had something important to do. When they arrived, Grace parked outside a grand mansion, its gates towering high. She turned to her sons. "Wait here, boys. I'll be back soon. I just need to see an old friend." With her head held high, Grace walked into the mansion. David, now Sebastian, looked stunned when he saw her. His carefully constructed world came crashing down. "Grace," he began, his voice shaky. "I." She held up her hand, silencing him. "Don't bother with apologies, David. Or should I call you Sebastian? You can't undo what you've done." David tried to explain, his words desperate. "I didn't mean for things to go this far. You thought you could destroy me, destroy my family, and walk away unscathed," Grace interrupted. Her voice was steady, her eyes fierce. "But you were wrong. I don't need your pity or your lies." As David stumbled over his words, a woman appeared, a glamorous figure who introduced herself as his wife. The betrayal stung, but Grace didn't flinch. She had come for closure, not explanations. She ended both their lives. Turning on her heel, Grace walked out of the mansion, her confidence unshaken. She approached the car where her boys waited, a renewed sense of strength coursing through her. As she got in, Ethan asked, "Mom, is everything okay?" Grace smiled at her sons, the 2 reasons she had survived the darkest moments of her life. "Everything's perfect," she said. "Let's go home." Epilogue. The cost of revenge. David had destroyed the Morgans, but in the end, his revenge cost him everything. He had power, wealth, and status, but he lost the one thing that could have brought him peace: love. Grace, on the other hand, rose from the ashes, stronger and wiser, but she was never truly happy again. Her journey proved one thing. When you set out for revenge, you may destroy your enemy, but you will always destroy yourself as well. If you enjoyed this story, kindly leave a comment, and subscribe to my channel for more videos. Thank you.